Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to start today with actually some words from Just Mercy. Keep beating the drum for justice. Before I start, I stand on the hallowed grounds of the Maroc Indians, meaning peaceful, the Algonquin tribe, formerly indigenous to this area prior to colonization in Freeport, New York, from where I sit. I acknowledge anti-Blackness exists along anti-indigeneity, and we should not work to rid one at the expense of the other. And so today, as we start with our first year read, I want to welcome all of you for this wonderful panel, for a wonderful book, Just Mercy, by Bryan Stevenson. My name is Renee Blake, and I'm a professor in the Department of Linguistics and Social and Cultural Analysis. I'm most proud of the classes that I teach to undergraduates, African-American Vernacular English, hashtag Black Language Matters, which is a freshman seminar, and a new class called Theorizing Beyonce and the Black Fantastic. I'm one of the associate producers of the film Talking Black in America. And so again, I want to welcome all of you. I believe that an angel lives and walks among us in Bryan Stevenson. And if you haven't read Just Mercy, I encourage you to access it. You can do that in book form. You can do it in audiobook or another form, film, as well as hearing Bryan Stevenson's words in his TED Talk, which is extremely impactful. So I've introduced myself, and I'm going to now hand it over to the other panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll go from there. Nikhil.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Renee, and thank you to John O'Hara for putting together this, this panel discussion. My name is Nikhil Singh. I'm a professor of social and cultural analysis and history here at NYU. I teach classes in social and political thought and in histories of capitalism. I also have done much of my scholarly work in African-American history and histories of social movements and African-American intellectual traditions. I'm also the founding faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program, and hopefully we will have some opportunities to talk a little bit about the work of the NYU Prison Education Program in this conversation. My fellow panelists have participated and supported and taught in this program to wonderful effect. So I'm very happy to share this time with them. Thank you.
And Harvey.
Hi, and thank you, Renee. It's such a pleasure to be here and to have gotten an opportunity to take the time to sit down and read the book, which of course I knew about, but I hadn't sat down and read from cover to cover. So I'm Anna Harvey. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and also affiliated with both data science and law. I'm the director of a lab in arts and science, public safety lab, that takes teams of faculty in social science and data science and tasks them to work on projects involving criminal justice reform. And one of our projects is about jails and pretrial detention in jails. And so that's a really important plot point in this book. And I hope I have a chance to talk about that in our work. We're also working with a number of district attorneys, prosecutors, who are interested in reforming the way that they decide whether to charge or dismiss cases, and the role of the district attorney in this book is also important, an important plot point. And finally, we're doing some work on racial disparities, both in criminal appeals and in policing. And so those are also, it's all relevant to the book. So it's really exciting to be here with this panel to talk about these questions today.
Thank you so much. Michelle Jones.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Daniel Jones. I got married in January. But I am a third-year doctoral student in social and cultural analysis. I rep hard. I got on my NYU t-shirt. And my research is interested in the history of carceral systems and collateral consequences of criminal convictions. My dissertation project will be centered around studying the creative liberation strategies that incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people deploy in order to survive incarceration. This book I read while I was incarcerated, and it had a profound effect on me. I finally felt like there were people who were speaking about the experience in a very deep and meaningful way, and not from a sanitized clinical criminological distance. And I was very grateful for this book, very grateful for the movie. And I'll share more about my experiences of going to EJI and meeting the staff, and just the overall experiences have been wonderful as a result of this one book.
Thank you so much. So I want to let all of the attendees know that you can type in your questions in the Q&A section, and we would love to hear from you. We hope that everyone here is going to really engage us for the next hour and be brave and to have uncomfortable conversations, as well as hopefully take action against racism and its intersection with gender, class, age, religion, and ability discrimination, both at NYU and beyond. And on that note, Nikhil, since so many of us have actually come through the prison education program through you, I thought it'd be great for you to start in terms of how this book impacted you and all of the work that you're also doing through NYU.
To remember this little mechanical thing of unmuting. Sure, thank you for the question. I'm happy to start us off. I, like Professor Harvey, I hadn't read this before cover to cover. I dipped in and out of it. I think I watched the movie once with my children, and I haven't even had the opportunity to meet Bryan Stevenson, my colleague, even though we have communicated about common interests and concerns. I think one of the things that's really remarkable about reading this book as it begins, and I think this is probably true for a lot of the students, is that he starts off as somebody who's in search of his own purpose, his own reason for pursuing a course in life that gives it meaning and significance. And I think many of us struggle with that question throughout our lives. And of course, we have to make a living as well as to make a life. And making a living can sometimes overwhelm the questions that we might have about the meaning and purpose of our life. So we're lucky if we can connect meaning and purpose to our ability to make a living. When I started out in the university, I think I had a great sense that ideas could change the world, and that as scholars, as intellectuals, as people who were engaged in the vocation of teaching, that we could really make a fundamental difference in the lives of the people around us. But I think for those of us who came into the university at the time that I did, I think it became increasingly clear that our society itself was bifurcating really profoundly, in the sense that opportunities that were available to some of us to enter into pathways that allowed us to advance, that allowed us to have professional opportunities, that allowed us to live comfortably, were increasingly moving further and further and further away from people around us for whom all of those pathways were blocked. And the thing that is really profound about this for those of us who teach at NYU is that many of those people for whom those avenues are blocked are maybe 1 to 2 miles away from where we go to work every day, in some of the poorest neighborhoods in this city and some of the poorest neighborhoods in this country, that send the largest concentration of people into the criminal punishment system. And those pathways, of course, have widened considerably for those groups of people who have been caught within them, groups that are defined, I would say, primarily and above all else by poverty, unemployment, lack of economic opportunity, and then, of course, by race, ethnicity, gender, and ability, and mental health status and other kinds of things that make people vulnerable to incarceration. So one of the questions I think that I had, that I think this book really resonated with, was how I could reconnect my sense of my purpose as a scholar with something that could reconnect that to some practical impact in the world, and that could reconnect my sense of my values and my professional activity with something that would contribute to both diminishing the pathways toward criminal punishment and widening the pathways towards various kinds of opportunities that many of us have been privileged to have in our lives. So prison education became one of those places, you know, and of course, Bryan Stevenson's book is in part detailing not only the rise of mass incarceration, the expansion of the criminal punishment complex along all of these different dimensions, but he's also detailing the ways in which the criminal punishment complex itself became more punitive over the last 30 years. One of the things that happened, even as it was growing and metastasizing and bringing more and more people into its nets, was that the opportunities for people inside prison, for rehabilitation, for education, for personal redemption, for the opportunity to improve their lives, was actually being slowly strangled. You know, and I think over the last 20 years, many of us, and you know, Michelle can speak to this very, very directly, you know, have kind of been clawing back some institutional space, have been figuring out how we can re-enter the prison and think about not how to make it better, not how to make it more humane. I mean, ultimately, that can't be our goal. Our goal has to be to make prisons obsolete, as Angela Davis puts it. But to go back into the prison and figure out how we can take some of that space back for other kinds of activities, for activities that actually allow people to experience a fuller human existence. You know, and I think as educators, that's something that we know how to do. And I think I was really, really struck by this in reading Bryan Stevenson's book, that that's almost what his experience is, that he goes into the prison and he discovers his purpose, but he also finds that the prison teaches him something really profound that he didn't know before, which is not only about what people in prison experience, but that the reconnection of our activities as people who have access to some degree of resources, some degree of authority, some degree of training, actually is made much more significant when we reconnect it to people who don't have those things. So, so anyway, that's just as a sort of a prelude to our discussion, and hopefully that can start us off with some thoughts.
Thank you so much. And John O'Hara, who is supporting us in this endeavor, can you please let us know when questions are there for us? So Nikhil, it makes me think of one of the lines in in Stevenson's book, which is the opposite of poverty is justice. And I think this is something that you seem to really be going after. You talked about memory and purpose. And I think, Michelle, you'd be the ideal person to lead us into that. Meaning, yes.
Absolutely, thank you. I just need to add one thing to what Nikhil, it's very hard for me to call him Nikhil because he's my professor, so I will try very hard to just say Nikhil. But Bryan is also credited with saying, quoting a Harvard, Howard Law School professor that said, "You're either a social engineer or you're a parasite." And that's exactly what NYU PEP is. We're socially engineering access to opportunity and resources for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated beings, right? And that's what the choice that we get to be as educators. We get to be a part of the social engineering as opposed to the choice of being a parasite. The work of, and remind me, Renee, what did you say? it's hard to call her Renee as well, but Renee, what did you say? The work of memory and
sorry, meaning and purpose.
Meaning and purpose. Absolutely. I think when you tie it to having access to higher education in prison, you are actually providing a pathway for someone who didn't even imagine that route to marry their meaning and the purpose was possible for them. You're literally giving them access to, and my own experience, I've talked to many women, and it was also my experience that I didn't think this was in my reach. So I had a desire to do something, to be more, to have access. But it has to be tied to these other structures where people are willing to provide those pathways, right? Those opportunities. And I think it's holistically transformational. I think for me, I graduated with my bachelor's degree while incarcerated. And I remember how huge it was to have all of the faculty there and the provost handing me my degree. Suddenly, yes, I was still incarcerated. I had to go back to my bunk at the end of the day, but I had on a cap and a gown and I was receiving a real degree. It was transformational. So suddenly I have a benchmark in my life that nothing about my experience of incarceration can take away from me. No matter what happens after that, no matter what happens, so 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 years down the road, I have a degree. And now I can look from this level, from this experience forward. I think that is particularly profound. And Brian talks about about this a lot in his work, that you cannot do this work. Hope and justice are connected. And you cannot do this work if you don't live a hopeful life. Otherwise, the barriers that we come against will leave us with despair and a sadness that is pervasive, and it eats away at your soul. Access to resources and opportunity leaves me hopeful. Now, did I think that all things would be just perfect now that I have a degree? No, but it gave me a hope of a better opportunity, that I could then move and operate from that space and make choices for myself, right? And so one of the things that I love about NYU PEP is that they make that commitment to the incarcerated student, that they follow that person out when they get out. And that was transformational for me. Literally, my faculty picked me up out of the county jail, got me on a plane the next morning, and got me to my orientation in New York the next day. And that's the kind of commitment when we're talking about the link between hope and justice for some of us. This is how reparation remediation actually is happening, right? Yeah, and I found that particularly profound, and particularly in this book. He starts from an interesting place in the idea that we all are broken. We've all broken something. We've all hurt something, someone or someone. And if we all start with the understanding that brokenness is where we all began, then where we all are, then we can move forward from this common experience. This is contradictory to the standard neoliberal thinking that you're an individual and that your achievement is all on you, and no matter what structures or sources are there or not there, it's all on you if you make it or fail. He's like, this is the common ground. He says, where's it at? He said, we are all broken. We are all hurt, and some, we have all hurt someone and have been hurt. But our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis for our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. It's our shared vulnerability and imperfection that nourishes and sustains our capacity for compassion. And that is a basis from which we can all work from, right? To be a social engineer versus a parasite.
Thank you so much for that. So early on in the book, he talks about this woman who says, hope better for one another. And I think, this idea of just hoping and working towards that is really profound. And I really think that you've articulated that so beautifully. So social engineering, advocacy, access. Anna, that's right up your alley. share with us a bit.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, first, I just want to say something because the first time that Michelle and I spoke was last week. We were on a call, like a little pre-call before this. And I didn't say it at the time, but you know, Michelle, when we admitted you, I was serving as dean of the graduate school, and your file came across my desk because we needed to find you housing because
Right.
that was one of the parole conditions, right?
Right.
And I just wanted to say I'm so glad that you're here and that you're doing well, and it's really nice to finally meet you in person.
Oh yeah, thank you. I had no idea. You guys don't come out and say who did what, whatever. But I am definitely grateful. And yeah, it was
Grateful
it
to
was
have
an
you.
amazing, crazy time, and I made it.
Yeah, you did, and you're thriving. So yeah, I actually, it's interesting listening to all of you speak. And one of the first things I wanted to say, especially to the students who are listening, is that, you know, we have all, you know, what this idea of social engineering and what Nikhil talked about, kind of finding, you know, a way to use your position in the university in a way that comports with your values, particularly in a world, you know, over the last several years where we've increasingly become concerned about what's happening in criminal justice, is that we all kind of represent different, we all come to this with different skill sets and different backgrounds, but that's not at all in any way for any of you listening an impediment. That you, no matter what your skill set is, there's a way for you to use it and to pursue your values. So I've been coming at this, you know, with some background and some training in data science, and finding just a way to use those skills. And while Nikhil and Michelle talked about NYU's work in prisons, one of the things we've been trying to think about is how to stop the flow of people into prisons. And one of the places we've been thinking about that is at the level of jails. So, right, so jails are different from prisons. Jails are run by counties. Prisons, when we use the word prison, we typically mean an institution run by a state where you're serving a sentence. But a jail is typically, like 75% of the people being held in county jails are being held pre-trial, meaning there's, you know, there hasn't been a predisposition. There hasn't been a disposition in their case yet. They've been arrested for something, but there's been, you know, many of them, in fact, the charges will be dismissed, as they are for Walter. And was really interesting to me, and I just want to highlight this point in the book, is that in theory, individuals are detained pre-trial because they pose some kind of a risk to the community. Maybe there's again, this is in theory, but there's a risk that they will commit some other offense before the disposition of their case, or a risk that they might not appear for the hearing of their case. In practice, we worry that pretrial detention, is being used by law enforcement authorities to better position the prosecution's case in a way that's essentially just not fair. And then two, we worry about the consequences of the practice of pretrial disposition on defendants later on. So just the first point, the worry about how pretrial detention gets used. Remember that in the book, it's Ralph, right? Ralph Myers, who was the individual who was initially arrested by the police for another offense. It's Ralph whom, I mean, they moved both Ralph and Walter during the period of pretrial detention. They moved them to death row, to be held on death row in the state prison during this period of pretrial detention before there's a disposition in either of their cases. And the experience is really traumatic for Ralph because he had an experience with being burned when he was a child, and they placed him next to the execution room. And you know, he folds, and he says essentially, you know, tell him I'll say whatever you want me to say. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just take me off of put me back in the county jail. And so, like, this is, you know, the concern is that this period of pretrial detention gets used to extract either pleas from defendants or witness statements or any other kind of evidence that might support the prosecution's case. And the consequences of this there have been one of the projects that we're working on. We have very little data on pretrial detention. We have very little data on jails. So we have this massive scraping project where we're going in and we're pulling daily jail rosters from about 1,000 county jails with defendants' names and charges and everything about them. And we're watching them over time. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is to further test a finding in the research that individuals who are detained pre-trial are actually, because of that detention, are more likely to be rearrested and rebooked and convicted for subsequent crimes. So it's, you know, you're detaching people from their jobs and their families and their lives, and that has a negative consequence down the road. And so that's one of our projects. But that plot point about how pre-trial detention was being used, I thought was really super interesting.
Thank you for that, Anna. I just want to, again, ask the students who are participating, number one, thank you. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on Zoom. So Anna talked about pre-trial. I actually want to talk a little bit about pre-trial and connect it to what's actually happening in the prison system. And I think I want to go back to Michelle talking about humanity and the fact that we are all broken. When I would teach at the prison education program, I would take this 3-hour drive from Long Island to get there. And then it would be a 3-hour drive back home. And I always remember getting into the car and just sobbing, absolutely sobbing. And it's as though the young men that I met knew that I was getting emotional when I had to leave them. And they said something to me that appeared in the book as well. And they kept saying to me, Renee, don't worry. We're going to be all right. Don't worry. I'm like, but I worry. I really worry. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why I was so worried and why I continue to be worried. It was actually difficult for me to be here today. I was rereading the book 2 nights ago, and I was reading about the part about this 14-year-old boy who is incarcerated and in the jail system and the ways that his body is abused. And I just started screaming and crying uncontrollably. And I think it was that I was just so tired of thinking about and experiencing the kinds of pain imposed on Black bodies, the ways that Black embodiment works, the ways that we as subjects take actions against oftentimes Black bodies doing the most mundane things. And so I wanted to kind of bring that to the forefront for us today. And I wanted to personalize it because I teach African-American language from over there, but what does it mean to actually speak it in the prison system? What does it mean to go to trial speaking African-American English and not be able to code switch so that other people see you in a different light and process your body in a different kind of way? You don't just speak language with your mouth, you speak language with your entire body. What happens when I teach an African-American English class and the incarcerated are saying to me, teach me to code switch. And I'm saying, but they're also processing your body, even if you don't say anything. And so I want to share that the other day I went to Stop and Shop to get some food. I picked up the food. It was late at night. I was pushing my cart and I saw a tall Black man who had a slight limp, a little disheveled, and he looked tired. But he was coming across my way, my path. And I'm not sure if I was crossing his path or he was crossing my path. And for a minute, my body tightened. And I'm always constantly reminding myself, I am a subject who can take an action for or against a person engaged in an activity. And I had to talk to myself. I said, relax your body, relax your body. And I had to make a decision as a subject who takes an action against a Black man who's doing nothing more than walking in the park area. What was happening here? I relaxed my body and I saw him just as a man who was walking across. And do you know what he was doing? He was taking the carts that people were pushing and he was putting them away. And so I want everyone on this call to think about that at every moment, we have subjects who take actions for or against Black bodies, oftentimes doing the most mundane activities. And that I want to encourage us as we do this work, as we think about Just Mercy, that we think about the ways that we're thinking about Black bodies, that we think about our actions for or against them, that we start to change the stories and our narratives, and through that we can perhaps start to change a system that has ingrained in all of us these kinds of atrocities against humanity. And so for me, I want to bring it to the Black body and the things that we impose on it. I'll leave it there. It's 2:30, we're at the halfway mark. And I'm gonna see if we have any questions and answers. We have no questions right now. And so maybe we can all just continue to engage, and I'll open up the floor for any of the panelists.
Well, really briefly, I appreciate everything that you said, Renee, because part of the fight that I'm working with against in Indiana is the use of solitary confinement as a punishment for COVID under a pandemic. And it's exactly what solitary confinement was already torture, but it becomes something else. It becomes mass torture when it becomes the solution of handling a pandemic versus giving people masks and social distancing and doing what they're asking the rest of the community to do. What their practices are is solitary confinement. And unfortunately, what happens in that situation is it creates another level of terror amongst incarcerated people because they're fearful to speak up if they are sick, and they're threatened to speak up if they are sick and if they're sharing a cell with someone. And I just want to read you briefly about a letter that was written in an Oregon prison about explaining what this is like. He said, a gentleman was locked up in solitary confinement with another person. And he was locked up in a cell with another person. And he said, I turned to my cellmate and I said, "You're not getting sick." He understood. I was not telling him that I expected him to avoid inhaling invisible COVID-19 molecules if they filtered into the bathroom with bunk beds that we share. I was saying that even if either of us got sick, we were going to ride it out without saying anything. By placing those who are sick in the hole, prison officials were sending a clear message. Getting sick is a serious violation of the rules punishable by solitary confinement. And this is what we need to be thinking about in addition to what we already know about the conditions of confinement and the ways in which bodies are punished beyond and violated beyond by simply being in solitary confinement. I can tell you countless stories of sexual assault because solitary confinement units, because everyone is locked up, usually will have one officer running that unit, and that officer can generally do what he wants or he or she wants. There's real concern in some of the fights that I'm doing is about real transparency. I feel like if a state receives funds from taxes from human beings who are in that state, there needs to be a new degree of transparency, oversight mechanisms that are bipartisan and non-government, so that we can actually see what's happening. A Black, brown body locked up in solitary confinement who doesn't have access to the rest of the world and internet and anything cannot get you this whole story. We have to do massive maneuverings to get small truths out to people that we hope that they will operationalize on our behalf. Brian in his book takes the time to connect this type of punishment, this type of work to the long history of slavery. He does that through solitary confinement and convict leasing. And he speaks of the mass incarceration of this current era as the fourth institution. And he increasingly makes us aware that we must recognize the links, the red threads between this. Obviously, mass incarceration is not slavery, but there are there are similarities in the way in which we treat Black and brown bodies and all incarcerated bodies, reproducing women's bodies, et cetera, in these places. One of the things that he highlights most importantly in another talk that, because I follow his work and I love him so much, is he said, we have to tell these stories. We have to be cognizant of the narrative. You said narrative and it just clicked for me. That we have to be very, very cognizant about how the narrative of our story as a nation is told. Instead of saying slavery happened, we need to say that Black people were kidnapped. We need to use the right language to increase what he calls the shame index. And not shame to berate or beat over the head, but to get people to acknowledge this, our shared story, our shared history of trauma, so that we can so we can move towards some healing. Obviously, in a revisionist history, a move toward revisionist histories where there is a movement to say, oh, we don't want to tell the truth in prison, truth about slavery in high schools to our kids. We want the histories to stay the same. The reality is that those narratives are incomplete and not complex enough to explain the realities that happens to human beings in these systems, right? And so he's advocating that we must increase our consciousness of wrongdoing. And that goes from slavery to the current experience moment under COVID-19 and a pandemic of locking down all bodies in cells. Right now, no programming, no access to opportunity. We have fought to get doors unlocked because people were locked in cells without any ventilation at all. This is the work of it. This is what is happening on the ground while people are, out in the world arguing over whether or not they should wear a mask. And so I agree with him that we need to increase our shame index. I think it would be smart to increase the consciousness of wrongdoing so that people can have a real reckoning. And you see that being driven by the current moment, the current George Floyd moment, and the aftermath of that. There is a racial reckoning happening. And I think that Brian is a part of that wave. I mean, over 5 million people have watched his TED Talk. He's instrumental to it. He is one of the reasons why the Art for Justice Fund was created. And Agnes and Miss Gunn sold one of her famous paintings and gave $100 million of those proceeds towards criminal justice reform and advocacy through the arts. This is part of that reckoning. And I think it has to continue as much as it possibly can.
Thank you so much for that.
I just want to add on to Michelle that also I think we're still learning about the reach, right, of some of these practices. There are still things we don't know, and one of the things that, but I think that we're starting to understand. One of the other things that struck me about the book was that, and I think Brian doesn't make much of it, but it just kind of stuck with me. That Walter had a pretty clean record, but it wasn't a 100% clean record. He had a misdemeanor conviction, just a misdemeanor conviction, and that gets kind of written off as like, well, that it wasn't relevant. But one of the things we're starting to find out is that there's the impact, the relevance of these little things, these little accumulations of arrests and convictions for minor things. It's like the fair beating isn't inconsequential, right? And the shoplifting misdemeanor conviction isn't inconsequential. And these things create, and we're starting to trace through how that happens. But in large part, it's not because it affects the person's behavior, it's because it affects law enforcement behavior down the road. It's like, they when they pull you over, they're immediately running you, right? And the fact that you might have just even a misdemeanor conviction for something small, it looks like that affects their behavior. And so you're more likely to be arrested and even convicted. And the next time, this is work we're doing with Rachel Rollins' office in Boston. She's the district attorney in Suffolk County in Boston. Next time it's on felony charges. So that we also need to start, and there's a racial cast to this too, right? It's not evenly racially distributed. And so we need to also start understanding how the net of even these minor things, the stops, the tickets, the arrests, the convictions for minor offenses accumulate and impact people's futures down the road.
Okay, thank you for that. And actually, I want to continue that line of thought. We actually have a question connected to this, and it really starts having you think about interrelational databases. So one of the questions that is being asked is, can our esteemed panelists speak a bit about how big data, ML, and AI advances have contributed to our current racial imbalances and ways in which this same technology is helping towards social justice?
Well, I can certainly say something, and then others can chip in. Certainly, one of the things that has gotten people really concerned is the use of quote unquote predictive policing, right? And so this is where, and there are software companies that sell this software to police departments, where essentially what they're doing is they're taking a department's database of prior arrests and prior stops, and they're feeding that into a prediction model of where they think, and they're taking that kind of naively as a record of crime, and then they're feeding that into a prediction model for where they think crime will appear in the future, and therefore where law enforcement agencies should direct their attention. And basically, it's like neighborhoods in which we've been making a lot of arrests. You should go there because probably you're going to find something that you will want to arrest somebody for. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating loop, of course. I don't actually think that, so my own view of this is that there was racially biased policing before we had, the software. There's racially biased policing in places that aren't using the software. It's not clear it makes it any worse. It certainly isn't making it better in and of itself. However, I'm also somebody who's an optimist about this. I think that if we work with impacted persons and advocacy organizations, public defenders organizations, local ACLU organizations, we work with district attorneys, we work with police departments, it would be possible to design, I think, assist tools that could help agencies reduce racial bias. Nobody's really doing that yet. I don't think it's, so I guess my view on this is that it's not the code itself that's the problem, it's that it's being kind of sloppily done and badly used. But I also don't think that AI itself or the software is producing the problem or even has necessarily made it worse. I think the problem is us. That's the thing we need to fix. We need to figure out how to cabin people's biases.
Right. I would just add that, yeah, the designing of the software is by designers who are intentionally, unintentionally bringing with their implicit and explicit bias that gets written into the code. I think for the person who asked the question, I would just offer 2 books, only because they've come up in more conversations this week, weirdly, than a few, and I would just offer them because I just have them with me. I would offer up Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, and Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, as two sources to do a deeper dive. I listened to a talk by Ruha Benjamin, and I think that she understands in a very deep way how she calls it the new Jim Code, rolls out racial discrimination, racial, class, and sex discrimination in a very profound way. And I think she's making a really good case for why we need to be aware of this, and is beyond in the technology, in all of these. I would also, like all this policing software, but I would also agree for any risk assessment tools that are being used in departments of corrections to do reentry. I have serious questions about that software, and reading that book, I haven't finished it, reading the first part of the book, it made me think that every risk assessment tool that I've used while I was incarcerated produced a thing about me that became the truth, whether that was true or not. And I think we need to be concerned about those systems being used by marginalized populations who are already within the system, not people who are being policed on the outside, but people who are already in those systems, and the softwares are being created to assess them.
Thank you. Actually, Nikhil, I want to go to you. We don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to ask you a question. We've been talking about implicit, explicit bias, and I want to go back to access to education. So in this moment of COVID, how does the prison education program work? And do you think that that has negatively affected access to education for those who are incarcerated?
Thank you. There's so much to say, and everything that everyone has said here has been so valuable and important, I think. And obviously we have a limited time. We could go on for a long time. And I know many of these discussions are going to continue. We have managed, because of a really quick thinking staff, to continue our program inside prison during COVID through basically kind of correspondence, very labored correspondence, where faculty produce written packets of material. We deliver them to the prison. There are clear instructions of what people are supposed to do. And then there's a written correspondence back, which we pick up and deliver back to the professor. It is very imperfect. We do not have access to this kind of technology. We're starting to get some limited access to what we hope will be some kind of video conferencing in the coming period, but it's very, very restricted. The technology inside the prison is very rudimentary. Not that we're advocating for better technology in prison necessarily, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And it's very difficult also to know exactly what's going on inside vis-a-vis COVID infection. The Department of Corrections is very cagey about it. You know, for some reasons that are probably understandable, but you know, I think to go back to Michelle's point, we need more transparency in all of these domains. I think, you know, Anna Harvey's work in jails is super important, because the jail's like a black box. I mean, it really is so hard to know what's going on in jails a lot of times, because as she noted, you know, people aren't even charged oftentimes, and they're just being held. And I think sort of all of these sort of examples, and I think what makes Bryan Stevenson's work so helpful to us, is they really show how we're dealing with this kind of a very dense kind of despotic mesh that has sort of developed and grown in our society. I think I remember reading a statistic that some 70 million Americans have some kind of criminal arrest record somewhere. I mean, that is a staggering statistic. I mean, if we think of a country that incarcerated 300,000 people in 1970, and then 2.3 or 2.5 million, you know, in the current period, and then 6 to 10 million people on parole, and then all the people with criminal records, and then all the impacted family members and community members. I mean, we really are talking about a kind of a carceral state, not as a kind of marginal or minor condition, but as a condition that has kind of grown up, as Stevenson said, as another kind of institutional iteration of a despotic order inside what we think of as a democracy. You know, and that's one of the reasons why we make comparisons to slavery. I mean, in addition to the kind of the racialized trajectories that also are part of the history in which we've discussed and you guys have pointed to, but it's that despotic ordering, that coercive ordering of power that is not transparent, that is not accountable, that is not devoted to improving human flourishing, that is actually immune in some ways to democratic correction. I mean, we've seen what just happened in Florida, where the state of Florida, the voters of Florida, voted to overturn felon disfranchisement laws. And the state of Florida then turns around and basically says, well, we're not going to enfranchise you unless you pay off all your fines and fees. Even though by law now we're supposed to enfranchise you because you've paid your debt to society. And then the person who's supposed to be enfranchised, who's now free, turns around and says, well, okay, let me pay my fines and fees. And they say, well, we don't really know how much you owe. So we can't even tell you how much you owe. So we're never really going to allow you to pay your fines and fees, and we're never going to give you the vote back. And the Federal Court of Appeals just upheld the state of Florida's position. So even when we're engaged in attempting democratic correction of this system, we're fighting a tremendous battle, on so many different fronts. And I think that the amazing thing about this moment, and this is why I think it's great that we're having this discussion at NYU and talking to students who are thinking about your pathways into the world, is that we are in a moment, as Michelle said, of reckoning. It's a racial reckoning. It's a reckoning with whether we're going to continue to be a democratic society. It's a reckoning with the relationship between policing, public health, and public safety. It's a reckoning, as Brian Stevenson put, with the sort of degrading legacies of inhumane punishment, which have really grown up inside our system and have been part of the American story going all the way back to settlement and slavery. And so we are reckoning with so many different things, and it requires so many different kinds of expertise and attention to think about how we redesign these systems, to think about how we collect data in better ways, in ways that are attentive to disparity and attentive to these kind of ethical violations, that think about how we reconcile a necessary demand for public safety with an ability to, as you put it so well, Renee, to not presume always that we are in a fearful encounter with some kind of other who is usually in a position of incredible vulnerability and disadvantage in relationship to us rather than the other way around, right? And all of these reckonings are happening now, and we're not going to solve it all, obviously, and nobody really can have a total perspective. I think we really do need to assemble the different kinds of resources to get back to the prison education program. I think one of the ideas we had when we founded this program, and I'm really excited to hear about Professor Harvey's research because we haven't collaborated yet, but it really is the idea that inside the university, inside the research university, we have so many tools, interdisciplinary tools that we can assemble to address real world social problems. And there is no bigger real world social problem, perhaps apart from climate change, than this kind of despotic criminal punishment system that has developed inside the United States over the last 30 years. So, so Brian Stevenson is, as I think you said at the beginning, is an angel that walks among us in the sense of his contribution, but there are many, many, many people here who are actually trying to think how they can make a contribution to this massive, massive challenge.
Thank you so much for that. We have one last question from a student, and we're gonna go live with the question. Ashley Kang.
Hello.
Hi there, Ashley. You can go ahead and ask your question.
I'll just read out what I typed. I asked, how can we reconcile the urgent need for video documentation of police brutality and murders that are circulating on social media right now as a means, both a means of informing the public and kind of reconcile that with the normalization and sensationalization of their pain and suffering?
I'm going to say something really quick while I have the mic on this, and I turn it over to the rest of you. I think it's a really, really good question. You know, I think one of the real challenges we grapple with is the extremity of brutality, and then the way we can become almost captive to a sort of a pornography of brutality or a pornography of violence, the way it circulates. And I think it's a really, really difficult thing, you know, and I think we have different responses to it based upon how we're situated. I mean, I don't watch these videos. I just won't turn them on. I won't circulate them. I think sometimes there's a reason to watch them. And I think I've heard detailed descriptions of the George Floyd video, which I've never been able to bring myself to watch. And obviously it spurred a tremendous social upheaval that is ongoing, which is against that kind of violence, not in support of that kind of violence. But I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. And, you know, people have been debating this question ever since abolition, you know, and the use of violent images of what happened to slaves under the extreme punishments that were meted out to them by slave owners and overseers, as a kind of tool of abolitionist agitation to say, look what brutality there was. And people have had arguments about whether circulating those images wasn't kind of redoubling the brutality. So I'd really be curious to hear what Michelle and Renee and Anna Harvey have to say about this, because I don't have a good answer except to say what I choose to do myself.
Thank you for that, Nikhil.
Really quick, I just would add, we're going through this right now with the, we've created a website for incarcerated people who have died as a result of COVID. And it's been a challenge to highlight the fact that these people have been basically set up in a situation where they were dying, and then, but also like not violating the privacy issue. And one of the things that we decided to do was like, it goes up if the family says it's okay. And we've made a commitment to like, pull the family members in to give them the yes or no, particularly in situations where someone has died, is no longer with us. The only way to do that fairly and rightly is to, it's hard, it's a hard question, is to have the family's permission, in my opinion. It's tough because you want to get things out. I think you share certainly with law enforcement so that they can see what they are doing. And then beyond that, it shouldn't be Instagrammed unless the family says it's okay. But that's me. It's a hard question.
You know, actually, Michelle, it's interesting because it's slightly different. Well, it is different from the circulating of the videos, which I'm with Nikhil. I won't circulate the videos myself, but I think it's the same time, it's kind of important that they're there, right? That somebody is there watching them. But when we're collecting, you know, hundreds of millions of jail records that are identified, and these are people who we've already talked about, you know, they've been arrested but not necessarily convicted. And so I actually went to our IRB, University's NYU's Institutional Review Board, and I said, I'd like you to review, you know, our protocols for maintaining the privacy of these individuals, and they wouldn't review it. They said, this is all data in the public record. There's nothing, it doesn't fall under the federal common rule that requires protection of privacy. And we disagree. So we're just making it up as we go along. We're kind of creating like summary data, but we're not releasing people's names at all. But that was kind of frustrating. I think it's a line that we all have to walk and balance.
I agree with all the panelists, and I know it's 3 o'clock. I'll just give my answer very quickly, and that is, I'm always curious about what people are watching and what they don't watch. So for instance, very few people have actually watched the interaction between Sandra Bland and the officer who stopped her. And if you actually look and analyze the language between Sandra Bland and the officer who stopped her before, you get some real insights into discourse analyses of how officers are using language and how it mismatches oftentimes African-American English speakers. So Sandra Bland was not necessarily using African-American English with the officer, but she had certain kinds of intonation that might not have been familiar to this officer, and how we can look at these really deep analyses and get a deeper sense of what's going on. On that note, it's 3 o'clock, and I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank the students who stayed here and hung in there with us, asked questions, listened, and Just Mercy, the story of justice and redemption. And I thank you all. And hopefully at NYU, we can continue asking these questions. We can continue pushing the envelope and really beating the drum for justice. I thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.